Hi, everybody. My name is Christy Savellano. I'm the Intake and Support Manager and Chicago Coalition for the Homeless Racial Equity Chair. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Hi, Alyssa Phillips. I am the Education Attorney at CCH. My pronouns are she and hers. And I was a Philly intern, and I definitely want to shout out Philly that it was an amazing opportunity. I'm still at the organization I was a Philly intern at. So definitely take advantage of the summer because Philly has a ton of resources that really benefit you long run.
Thanks, Alyssa. So yeah, our presentation is client interviewing techniques and best practices from the field. And we have a lot of slides, so we're just gonna probably talk fast, but I think Brent will be sending you everything. And if you have any questions after, you could just email one of us. It's gonna be a little awkward because we'll be doing this. Is there like a way where I could just, sorry. This is like really hard to do. Sorry. Oh shit. Sorry. Sorry, everybody on Zoom. Is there any way that one of you can like scroll for us? Thank you. This is hard. Yeah.
Do you want to use?
I apologize. I should have sent you the presentation, not the
If
PDF.
you can make it into a version where you can just hit next. Here's a way to.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Much better. So yeah, we are the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. We were founded 42 years ago. We are a policy advocacy organization. And the Law Project was founded in 1997, which was 25 years ago, if I did that math right. And our focus is for focusing on rights of folks experiencing homelessness. So Alyssa, if you wanted to talk about our law work.
So one of the things that kind of makes CCH unique is that we have a law project, a policy department, and an advocacy organizing department. So we kind of try to look at issues through a macro and micro lens. So for our law project, the way that we kind of go about serving clients is our Youth Futures mobile legal clinic. So we do legal clinics at youth drop-in centers, at family shelters, at high schools, libraries, to meet clients where they're at. That was launched in 2004 by an Equal Justice Works fellow. And then that has expanded as well. So we do civil legal services to unaccompanied homeless youth. We also help with things like public benefits, IDs, sealing and expungements, employment, housing, education. We do some civil rights litigation against the city for things around like tent encampments. We also advocate and help promote and assist with some like legislation, so like the Homeless Bill of Rights. And we have consent decrees, both with Chicago Public Schools and with DCFS on kind of some class action to support people experiencing housing insecurity in Chicago Public Schools, as well as who are youth in care in DCFS.
And then through this presentation, we'll discuss all these different things you can read, so I'll just hit next.
So some of the goals of this presentation that you guys will hopefully get out is learn some skills to have some trust building with your clients, to establish next steps with them, obtain relevant and accurate information in a trauma-informed way, and creating practices that incorporates holistic perspectives to grow as an attorney.
So the first part is settings of client interviews. At CCH, common interview methods for us, especially with COVID-19. A lot of it is phone and video right now, but also pre-pandemic, and we're going to be turning over this summer to a hybrid model of, in office and then also working from home. So there's in-person office intakes on this, working with folks in the street and community settings. So we really like to focus in community lawyering and meeting clients where they're at in the communities that we serve. So that's why we do a lot of work in the community. So with a phone interview, so I manage the intake at CCH. So with that, with a phone, right, establishing who you are and your role. So even if a client calls you, they may not fully comprehend the legal aid providers and what we do. So hi, my name is Christy. I'm from the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. This is our we assist folks experiencing homelessness with their legal needs, and then kind of saying like what different things we assist with, and then so they kind of know like, okay, this is what they're looking for. And then a lot of our clients, right, like they might be calling on the bus or just out in the community or in a shelter. So making sure when they're calling, right, or if you're calling them back, asking if they have time to answer questions for 20 minutes, because that's usually our average of what our intake is. And then with phone interviews too, right, a lot of clients, they want to start talking, telling you their issues. But before that, to really avoid the, just giving a lot of information right to you, letting them know that here are the sets of questions that I'll be asking. We just want like the big summaries and not the details. So really redirecting that, just because sometimes you get bombarded by a lot of details, and that's one of the reasons is, right, they want to share with somebody their issue, because sometimes they're on the phone trying to call 10 different resources and they can't get to anyone. That's just a realistic of what is happening with us and other organizations as well right now. So with that, sometimes it's hard to control, but prompt clients that in order to figure out the solution, potential action, you'll need to start intake and interview, and then obtain basic information, right? I really like to tell the clients right away that these are the questions I'm going to be asking. It's very generic. This is the first step before we go on and see if we can take their case or not. So, and the biggest thing is never promise that we can help them right away, especially if it's the first intake, because sometimes we can't, and you have to break that to your client, right? So video interview, pretty much very similar with that, right? With a phone interview, it's very quick. It's around 20 minutes for an intake, and these are, we use Zoom, and we work with providers to set it up. So we had funding, and we would give some of our providers that we are in relationship with some iPads or Chromebooks, so they can, set it up during a time when we can do an intake call with them. So thinking about that when we were, working from home and still connecting with clients. So again, these are the highlights, right? Establishing who you are in your role first, making sure that you let them know this is the basic. And someone's not on me, but and then the biggest thing here is just make sure you have a good internet connection, right? And then also, especially if you're working from home, make sure the door is closed. Confidentiality is really important when working with clients. So make sure it's quiet and no one else can hear your conversation. So that's pretty much it for that.
So as things are starting to open up more and have more in-person things. There's going to be more like in-office interviews. So a couple of things that are really important, especially through this kind of transition back, is making sure your client can actually travel to the office. There's no point in trying to establish a meeting time if just realistically they don't have the resources or capacity to come. So make sure they might agree and say yes because they need help. But when you actually ask them questions, they might not be able to really get there. So making sure you have an understanding of that so you're not wasting anyone's time. Make sure that you understand their comfort level, especially with someone entering like a corporate setting. So if you have a client who, is staying on the street, they might not have a comfort going into those buildings because maybe they have a really bad experience, right? Maybe they've been kicked out or harassed. And so get an understanding of where they're at and making sure too that your building is a place that they're going to be okay coming into. So if that's telling the person, if you have someone who's in the like front entranceway who's greeting people, that they know you have a client coming, or however that works in your building, but making sure that they're not going to be told to leave, that they're not going to be re-traumatized by entering your setting. Again, make sure travel to and from, it can be cost and time prohibitive. So make sure you have an understanding too of how your office works. Does your office give out bus cards and CTA cards that you can tell your client? How long realistically from where your client is to the office? Do you need to set up kind of a middle ground, like having a real understanding of where your client and your office are, space and time wise? Also, like I mentioned, understanding barriers, like if your client, isn't going to be able to enter a spin door, making sure your building has a way for them to enter. Is it ADA accessible? What are the limitations of your client or of your building so that they're not placed in a position that makes them feel uncomfortable when they're trying to get help? Also have an understanding of, are they going to need to bring their children with them? Are they going to need to bring a family member with them? Do you have space, a waiting room, a place that's going to be safe and accommodating or not? Because if you don't have that space, then you need to kind of figure out another way. And then also have a realistic time set up for the client. So if you have a lot of questions to get through, if you're doing an SSI application and you know there's a lot of questions to get through, don't tell your client it's going to be 20 minutes because it's not, right? Have an understanding of really what that time is and ask people around you too. If you don't know how long that time is going to be, ask people who have done it in your office. Make sure you can realistically tell them because they might be taking time off work. They might have picked up their child early from daycare. Like you want to know, you want to respect their time. So making sure that, that's set out in a clear way and also for their mental health as well, because it's hard to ask questions about answer questions for a long time about a really hard thing. So know too, are you going to have to create breaks? What's going to be needing, to give proper time for that. So sometimes too, you have to meet clients where they're at. And so sometimes we do meetings on the street. We work with folks who are residing on the street or living in tent encampments. And this is sometimes necessary. Maybe they just cannot get to your office or get to another place. So one is gauge the comfort level, right? If this is a situation where you need to meet with the client outside, are they okay with that, right? Are they comfortable with that? Do they understand they're in an outside place? Always ask if this is a good time to talk. Maybe you've set up a time to meet with them and then you get there and you realize something really bad has happened to them that day, or they are, in a space mentally where they just cannot talk to you. So ask, right? Maybe you have to reschedule and be okay with that flexibility. Always making sure that it's a good time for them. Exclude others when necessary to ensure confidentiality and create a respectful place. So sometimes maybe they have a couple people with them and maybe you ask them like, hey, are you okay with these people in this room? And maybe they say yes, but really having an understanding like, hey, this is confidential information we're talking about. Can we have this conversation one-on-one, which sometimes does need to happen. And then always make sure that if it is something where you need to reschedule, suggesting a specific rescheduling point and time. And if this didn't work the first time, have a realistic understanding that you might need to change it up. So, right, if maybe you need to think of some other creative solutions, because if you're going to schedule a time to meet again, if they're staying in a tent encampment at the same place, the same issue might be going on, right? Maybe they don't feel comfortable because someone else is always there. So think of how you can switch it up if that's, needed. Okay, so another place we meet clients a lot, which I mentioned, is community settings. So schools, shelters or drop-in programs, coffee shops, fast food places. So if you're meeting someone in a school, obviously the most important thing is you need to figure out who in the school, where you can be. So a lot of the times that's meeting with the guidance counselor and saying, hey, I need to meet with this person. Is there an office? Is there a private place we can do it? Making sure you have all the clearances you need from the school beforehand. So if you're going into a CPS school, sometimes you have to get different like volunteer clearances, and sometimes that takes a little time. So be mindful of what you need to do beforehand, who you need to talk to set it up. Shelter drop-in programs also, it's important to always follow up. So if you're going to schedule a time to meet there, asking them, do you have a private place we can be? And then following up that day, because maybe something's happened, right? Where you might get to that location and then now, something happened with the building or there was some incidents and you can't meet there anymore. So just making sure you're doing that prep work and following up. If you're meeting at a place that serves like food or coffee, be prepared to buy food or coffee for your client. So asking your organization like, hey, do we have funds for this is important. But that's just something to know, especially, you know, when you're working with someone who is experiencing homelessness, hunger, and insecurity is a real thing. So if you're in a location that's serving that, you should probably be prepared for that. And just be aware too. So if you're, a lot of these community settings, they're going to lack privacy. So you need to make accommodations to still protect their confidentiality. So if that means you make sure you have all your questions typed up. So if there's things like you need to get someone's social security number, they can write it down and you're not asking for them to say that information out loud. Or if it means, you know, asking the questions you can and then saying like, hey, we'll follow up over the phone when you're in a private place and I am, but figuring out how that works.
And then so starting the interview, as you know, I've already mentioned that before you start the interview, you make sure that you're asking your client that if it's okay, if we can talk at this time, and if not, you can call them back and then introduce yourself and let them know what type of questions you're going to be asking. But also, right, if you don't speak the same language as your client that's calling, make sure to familiarize yourself with the resources and policies your agency has for translation services. And if they're struggling to respond, right, and you, for us, our protocol, we have attorneys or folks in our staff who speak Spanish. When folks call, I can let them know that this attorney is going to call them back, and so they can speak Spanish, you know, and making sure that, right, like when a client calls, like they're already in a really, they're really stressed. So making sure that, you know, remaining calm and also just making sure that they're feeling the most comfortable as they can. So one thing is, you know, providing translation services. So, and then making sure that you have a protocol. So when you are at an organization, make sure you are asking them. And also too, like highlighting this, if they use a family member or a friend as a translator, just be careful about confidentiality. And like, I usually, if someone is translating for their parent, I usually don't like to do that just because it's usually the child that's translating. So making sure that if the child's speaking English, you can let them know that we have these services and we can call them back, just because that is a lot of, you know, responsibility for that child, especially if they're calling for help. So when you start the interview, again, I've said this a bunch of times, but make sure you introduce yourself first, and then asking their name. So, and also asking folks their preferred name and pronouns, and their gender pronouns. So it's just a sign of respect, inclusivity, and also just not assuming, right? And just normalizing that. So, and then when you start an interview, just explain to the client that the information they share with you will remain confidential. So let them know that I will share this with our law team, and that's the only folks that will know your notes, etc. If you're taking notes, and then again, you might need to explain what this means in the context of a legal interview, and then also encourage your clients to ask relevant questions at any time, and just create for space for conversation. It's not an interrogation, right? Just because like when they are telling you all the things that they need assistance with, it's usually, you know, it's a lot connected to their emotions at that time, and just again making sure that they're comfortable in that space.
And I think too with the confidentiality, I think sometimes as like attorneys, as law students, we hear this all the time, but it's really important to like really ingrain it in your client, because a lot of times they might be afraid to share information because they really do think, you know, their child might get taken away by the state, that their public benefits that they need to live are going to be taken away, that their voucher is going to be taken away if anyone knows what they did. And for us to represent them, we need to know everything. And so, you know, we say it like once, maybe kind of flippantly, and we understand what it means, but really saying it multiple times is really important, because I know I just had a client recently who we've been working with for months and months and months, and I felt like I had said it a lot, but like the day before a really big issue, she informed me that she had been lying about something because she was really nervous. And so you have to really, really make sure your client understands that, like, this attorney-client confidentiality is sacred. It is not going to be breached. These are the people who will know this information. I am not a mandated reporter as an attorney, right? So I'm not going to be telling this information that you're afraid of, so that we really can know the most information to be able to help them.
Thanks, Alyssa. And also, again, consider the following, making sure you get the basic information, as I mentioned a couple times now, and also with the basic information, right? If you don't need to ask for their social security or their birthday, etc., make sure you're balancing not asking, like the sensitive information right away, like social security or income. And also, you may not know what sensitive information is triggering for the client. So just make sure that, looking at questions, what you're asking, and kind of like having a flow in your mind and prepping yourself before you are asking the questions with a client.
Yeah, and I think just to add on that too, I recently had a client where the issue was the child hadn't been in school for years and years and years. And the reason the mom hadn't been sending the child to school was because there was a really, and insert like trigger warning, an abusive situation. And she was really nervous the dad was going to take the child from school. So she was trying to protect the child. And so the child's name was a sensitive piece of information, even though in maybe any other interview with a client, that's something I would ask right away, right? Like, what's your child's name? What's their date of birth? That's a pretty like basic one. But for this client, I needed to wait until I had established that relationship with them, because that was a sensitive piece of information. So also realizing like something that's sensitive to one person might not be to someone else, and kind of being able to gauge that. So you know where in your attorney-client relationship you can ask that information. So throughout the interview, make sure that you use clear and simple language, which seems really simple and it actually can be really challenging, right? We know that a lot of times laws and policies are written in ways that are not clear and are in legalese, and we spend our whole time in school learning these legalese, and so then of course we can like regurgitate it, but that's often not helpful for the client. So you need to have such an understanding of the issue that you can say it in a way they will understand. So making sure that you have a clear idea of the law and the policies around this, so you can break it down for them, because that is part of your job. And try to avoid, legal terminology, especially that might be triggering. And being thoughtful, because a lot of the times our policies and our laws have triggering language in them. So being thoughtful of how can I phrase this in a way that's clear, that is accurate, but that my client's going to actually be able to grasp. Ask open-ended questions to let the client provide the interview. And then ask follow-up and clarifying questions when you need more information. So I don't start interviews by saying like, okay, I saw from the intake that, you have an issue with an SSI. I usually start with, all right, like, what can we do for you today? What's going on? And then kind of funneling it down like you would in a deposition, even though you're not deposing your clients necessarily, but making it that funnel so you kind of can get a true understanding of what's going on. Understand that clients may be seeking help from various sources, including other legal providers. And so families, friends, caseworkers, aldermen, so have an understanding of that. Usually by the time a client gets to us, we're not the first person they've talked to. But you should know that information. Like, let's say they have an attorney who's helping them with something else. Understand where that kind of division is. Is that something that's going to intersect, or are they two kind of completely different legal issues we can keep moving forward on? Do they have a caseworker? And if the caseworker if they're comfortable with you reaching out to the caseworker, that's usually really helpful. We work with caseworkers a lot, and that can be great for gathering documents, because maybe they've already given all these documents that you need to the caseworker. So make sure you have an understanding too of family and friends who might be helping them, and if they're comfortable with you talking to them. So they might come in with a family member, and then through the relationship with them, you realize like, oh, actually they don't want, they're not comfortable really with information being shared. So make sure you have an understanding of kind of the whole situation. Make sure several forms of contact information are obtained. So a lot of times with our clients, they might not have the same cell phone number. Maybe some months they have data and some months they don't. Some of them might have access to email, some might not. Some might have like text messages, some might just use like WhatsApp. So understand what are the forms of contact and what are the reliable ones, right? They might have an email, but if they don't really know how to check it, if they don't know their password, that might not work best. So get as many different contacts as you can, and ask them to like, what are some secondary ones if I need to get a hold of you, right? Like if you're working with someone, is there a family member whose phone number they can use if you need to reach out to them, or knowing where they consistently go. So with us, it might be that a youth doesn't have a consistent phone number, but they're consistently at Broadway Youth Center on Thursdays, right? So get an understanding too, that's part of their contact information. Where are they going to be typically on these days? So if something happened, you needed to reach them, you could find them. So this is kind of our what happens. If a client gives more information than is necessary, which happens a lot, right? They want to share their story, they're struggling to get help. So ask questions as a way to redirect the interview. So an example on the slide is, I understand that there are a lot of details you want me to know. Can you tell me this if that's what you really need? Because I want to focus on the specific information to help understand. And a lot of times too, what happens is clients have multiple intersecting things going on in their lives, right? They most often, it's not just like they have one issue, right? There's usually multiple. So a good way too is redirecting to like, okay, I want to help you on this first. Can we focus on this first? I understand there are all these issues that we need to get to, but can we do this one first? Because they all require kind of different things. If a client doesn't understand a question, which also helps, think of different ways to phrase it. Don't get frustrated. It's not the client's fault. Understand how you can make it, ask the question, break it down in a way that they will be able to answer. Attempt to understand what are the factors that prevent comprehension. So sometimes it's the language. There's a language barrier. Sometimes it's the certain terminology that we use that we've been taught. Sometimes it's the speed you're talking. Sometimes you need to slow down. Sometimes it's the setting. So if your office looks like a DCFS office, right, where maybe they had a bad experience with the child welfare system, maybe they're just going to be in a trauma triggered place that they can't really understand you. So can you move? Can you switch it up? Can you make your office a space that doesn't look like that? So figuring out what are the issues, and maybe it's just the day. Sometimes we have clients who on certain days, they're angered. And so because they're angered by things that are happening to them, they just can't sit down and answer your question. So pick a different day, right? Be flexible, figure it out. How can we work around this issue so it can be successful? And don't just try to power through, because that might just end really poorly.
And within our law project, so we have social workers. So within our client intake, right, a lot of the our social work values also connect with the community lawyering. And one of the client interviewing methods that we use that is connected to social work or counseling is motivational interviewing. And with that, so this approach is really client-centered and sets the stage to fosters just building a relationship and rapport with a client, and also just kind of what it looks like for, if a client needs assistance, and what does that process look like, right? And this is one of our foundations when it comes to client interviewing. And within motivational interviewing, there are skills we called OARS, O-A-R-S. You can develop to connect with clients. So one of them, the O, is open-ended questions, right? Making sure that if you have time, or a client, if you need more to that answer, right? Asking open-ended questions for those details. And also it's A is affirming. So it's a strength-based method, acknowledging that, thank you for meeting with me today, especially since it seems like you've, tried to call other places. And I appreciate that, etc. And also reflective listening, which we'll get into a little bit in the next slide. But just not butting in and making sure that you're really present with them during that time when they are letting you know what's going on in their life. And then also just summary, S is summarizing the statement at the end. So with that, right, after they let you know what they have said, right, you summarize with them, this is what you told me, I heard you, right, and then making sure that they're in the same page. So I usually like to, one, at the end, summarize what my client said to make sure that I will relay that to the law project. And then also these are the next steps. So I usually give them one or two things, like we'll call you in a couple of days. If I need a document from you, this is what you need. So at the end, just making sure you're closing your interview with a summary. And with this, obviously, I'm sure that within your law career, right, this is really important, is just listening to the client and also without judgment. So this is really important, and making sure they feel that you've heard every word and that you're fully present again and listening to them. And again, it's called active listening, right? Fully understanding and internalizing what the client is saying. And whenever the client says, or whatever the client says, don't assume anything about their situation or their circumstance, and treat them with unconditional positive regard. So, basic acceptance, supporting the person regardless of the person says, verbally affirming, right? I see, I hear, thank you, I understand. And just also using nonverbal cues to show understanding, such as nodding, right, eye contact, and leaning forward if you can. But I know with COVID, right, I feel like you also have to think about your boundaries. What does that look like for you when it comes to the space when you're meeting with a client? But basics, eye contact, and making sure that you are having those nonverbal cues. And also I like practicing them as well. And then just demonstrating concern. And I feel like when I meet with clients, like they'll know, like, if you are really like in it for them, or like really are like a good energy. I feel like a lot of clients sense that, and just like making sure that like when this is the first time they're meeting you, right? So again, making them feel comfortable, and making them feel that you are really listening to them at this time.
Okay, so the conclusion of an interview is really important. Obviously the beginning is for setting the stage, but concluding it kind of also sets the stage for the rest of your relationship with this client. So one thing that is super important is managing expectations. And so I'm sure you guys have heard this, but I can't emphasize it enough. So, right, clients often come to you on their worst day and they just want you to fix this thing that feels so big to them. Sometimes we can, and it's pretty quick. A lot of times it is steps and stages and a little forwards and a little backwards. And so have that realistic expectation with your client, even when it's hard, right? So you can say, this is what we can do for you. This is what we can't do for you. And this is realistically what that is going to look like. Explain how long it will take, right? It is really hard for someone to comprehend why something they desperately need to live is going to take so long to get. And that just often is the reality. And so having an understanding, right? So if you're getting a SNAP card for someone, right, and they need access to food, and that is vital to them being able to live, there are only some minimal circumstances you can get it within 5 days. Most of the time it's going to take 30. And so sometimes it means showing them the policy, saying, hey, here on the DHS website is what it says the time frame is. We submitted it on this date, this is the date, but really explaining that to them so they can prepare and know, and don't tell them something is gonna happen quicker or easier than it's gonna be. Establish when they will hear from you again. And this is really important because I think most of us, we have really good intentions that we're gonna, follow up right away, but realistically, right, we have a lot of clients, we have a lot of things going on. And so one thing that I've kind of worked on doing, instead of telling my client, like, I will get back to you on this date, I tell my client, if you haven't heard from me by Friday, give me a call. Here's my number, here's my email. So have a date that, and sometimes this is set for you, right? If you have a court date, if you have a hearing, you know the dates. But if it's not, say, okay, by this date, call me if you haven't heard from me, because that also gives some power to the client as well as holds you accountable to that date. Making sure you are putting stuff in your calendar, that you're realistic about your time frame, right? If you have a bunch of cases going on and you know you cannot get to the client until the next week, let them know that, because it's worse for them to be like, okay, this person's helping me, and then not understand why it's taking so long to get back. Don't tell someone, and I will say this, don't give someone a really intense deadline unless there is like a court that is telling you that is the deadline. Because you might say, yeah, I'll get to you by the end of the day, and then an emergency might happen. So don't tell a client that you're going to get to them by a very specific time. Give yourself a window, because we're humans and human things happen. And that protects you and the client. Again, make sure you're giving multiple ways to contact the client at the end of the interview. Get their email, get their phone number, get whatever contacts from other people they might use, figure out where they are going to be, get all that information, because you just don't know. It might seem like they have a consistent phone one day and then they might not the next day. Ask for personal information at the end of an interview after you've built trust, and also after you kind of have a determination of what it's going to look like. So for instance, if it seems like, yeah, we're going to move ahead, we've got this information, we're going to be able to, apply for SSI for this client. Once you've kind of thought about, then get their social security number, right? You probably don't need that information before you've kind of realized that. So get those kind of questions at the end. So that you're not just having a client give you all this personal information and then telling them like, hey, we can't help you.
So racial equity. So this is our definition, so you can read it. But racial equity, we have a racial equity committee at CCH. It started almost 7 years ago. And like many other organizations across the country, our racial equity work at the coalition started when staff wanted space to talk about what was happening across the country, Black and brown people dying at the hands of the police. And the death of Alton Sterling in 2016 was a precipice in wanting to do something within CCH to address and fight against racial injustices as an organization. So within our organization, we have a committee in connection to racial equity. We have different goals, and also just, we have our purpose, etc. But also, how does this connect to our work with clients? So CCH 2021 client data, right? Before that, while before I was not there, the staff really discussed what we can do in reality to what was happening across the country. And it's important because people experiencing homelessness are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And just like a highlight, a quote is from Housing Action Illinois. Despite making up 14% of the population of the state, Black Illinoisans make up 30% of the residents experiencing poverty and 59% of residents experiencing homelessness. So that quote right there from Housing Action Illinois really highlights the inequities and systemic racism in our systems. And while CCH has turned 42, right, and racial equity work within our organization has only been 7 years, we really wanted to have a committee that really understands accountability doing this work. And with that, in connection to the data from Housing Action Illinois, our clients, 50 or 60% are Black, identified as Black, 18% Latinx. So in connection, again, highlighting that people of color disproportionately experience homelessness. And that is why it's so important to really have a lens to practice law or being in this field, right, with a racial equity lens. And with this, I took some of these slides. If you ever get a chance to, if you go to Loyola, Naya Kelly is a professor there, and she is our state legislative policy director at CCH and also the director of equity and transformation. This is some of the things I'm just gonna one of the things that's really important to start is really understanding implicit bias and what that means for you. So everyone has implicit bias, stereotypes that impact our understanding of others, affecting our actions in an unconscious way. And it's a preference for a group, positive or negative, often operating outside of our awareness. Based on stereotypes and attitudes we hold that tend to develop early in life and tend to strengthen over time. And you can go through this as well, because there is like an implicit bias resource that we have, right? But how does this show up when you are connecting with clients or working with folks that are different from you? So expressions of implicit bias towards individuals, right? Standing further away, making less eye contact, moving across the room, etc. Harsher judgment of facial expressions, shorter conversations, less speaking time. And it affects how we interview, awkward, less effective communication, misunderstandings and resistance to ask questions or clarifying questions, or just shutting a client off, and we can't help them, right? Less likely to inspire trust or that comfortability, impedes our ability to get the whole story from our clients. And then, yeah, you could use this if you have some time. It's implicit bias tool to measure bias. You can anticipate taking like 30 minutes. We usually do this with all our law interns and also our social work interns in the law project. And with this, asking questions, right, and really understanding, and I think part of being a good social worker or a good attorney is really thinking about how you present, right, especially with clients, what power you hold, what privilege you have. And if you don't know the answers to those, you should think about it, especially if you are in public interest settings. How did you feel when you saw the results of your test? What connections? And really doing internal reflection, because when it comes to this work, you have to know yourself, know what that looks like for you, because it's really going to affect your practice and really connecting with folks in the field. And then centering racial equity in law. So again, understanding and learning about implicit bias that you have, naming and understanding history and how your profession or organization perpetuates and is connected to white supremacy and racism.
Yeah, I think too, as a white attorney, it is our responsibility to commit to unlearning and taking actions to dismantle these systems that continue to maintain white supremacy and racism, shifting power and centering people of color. And it's our job. It's not our colleagues of color to teach us. There are so many great resources, and it's your responsibility to find those resources and to learn for yourself and to realize that this is a significant centering part of your work. It's not just something you do when you have time or that you put off because we're all busy. And that's not an excuse to not do the work because it impacts every part of our ability to assist our clients. And it's really important to recognize and check the power dynamics that come from lawyers being disproportionately white and legal aid clients being disproportionately Black, Indigenous, people of color, and being aware of what that power means when you go into spaces and when you're meeting with your clients. And it's not something that you can put to the side. It's something you have to actively be engaging in. And lastly, this work is lifelong and it's continuous. There's never going to be a point where we can be like, yes, we figured it out. Yes, we're no longer racist or struggling. It's something that takes lifelong checking, working, educating, unlearning, and something that is critical to your ability to really do good and to help our clients. So these are some recommendations and some books that I would really recommend reading. that have some good information about kind of law and racial equity. And again, just sort of points to how many wonderful resources there are and how it's on us to make sure that we're engaging and taking time with those resources. There's also links to kind of a lot of other ones as well.
And then it sounds like you're going to be doing an intensive trauma training afterwards. So we'll quickly go through this. I know we're running out of time probably, but I really like this quote. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. So when interviewing a client with trauma, so especially when you're working with Black, Indigenous people, color, and vulnerable populations, you'll have encountered clients who have experienced various types of traumas, historical, intergenerational traumas. Highly recommend getting additional training, which you will. So I will just move on that. So tips of handling trauma. Even as a social worker, I still continue to learn different ways to connect with my clients to really uphold a trauma lens when it comes to this work. So if a client discusses a traumatic situation with you, show appreciation for their willingness to share. So thank you for sharing this with me, and also just making sure that, you know, again, highlighting that what is discussed in this space is only, you know, with us, unless it's okay for me to let my client or my team know. And also it's just important to hold space for a client and have a strength-based approach. And with that, just making sure that, you know, you're taking the time to really listen, the active listening and motivational interviewing. When it comes to, you know, sharing something, sometimes it's the first time they've shared it with someone else that's not their family, or this is the first time that, you know, and making sure, I think too, like you have Kleenex, or you have, like, when it comes to trauma-informed care as well, when it comes to your office, dimming lights, what does that look like? And I think Alyssa highlighted that, right, with the DCFS example. And also sometimes trauma results in anger. A client may express anger towards you because people seeking legal assistance feel a sense of having been wronged or their rights have been violated. Again, when they come to you, right, sometimes it's the worst day of their life. So making sure that that's, you know, a constant reminder when a client walks into the room and they're really upset and angry. Your questions may be difficult for clients to answer, as Alyssa highlighted. And again, like, also understanding that it's not about you. And, like, you know, taking it for a grain of salt. If, you know, if they're yelling at you, it's not you. They're just letting, you know, their emotions out. And if you're unable to help, they may feel powerless as well. Again, when that power dynamics comes to play, right? And again, stay calm. Try to empathize and seek guidance for agency staff. So asking your supervisor, right? I think that's when supervision really is important. Walking through with your supervisor, I had this client, what can I do the next time? Or, like, if it gets too much, you can, you know, ask if your supervisor can come in, etc.
I also want to say too, like, around asking for help. I know, like, I've had clients who are angry or frustrated whenever there is something that goes wrong, and they just scream at me, or they walk away, or they hang up. And so I learned, right, like Christy, as a social worker at our organization, I would ask her, like, what are some tips? How can I need to get through this. My client really needs this, and they are just so angry, and so it's preventing it. And so she would help me kind of walk through, like, why don't you do this and this and this? So figure out what are the resources in your organization, because as attorneys, we're not really trained for that, and that just happens. That's part of it. And so figuring out who in your organization is trained, or maybe has some more support that they can give you. So it's always important to refocus the client back to the original question. So sometimes when you ask a question, it's going to trigger your client to go off, because they're going to remember all the things they feel like have wronged them and the pain that they're in. So refocus it back to the specific one, and keep pointing, like, this is our goal. We need to get here. So I'm going to we need to go back to what this question was. I see what you're saying, but we need to get to this point. Ask the person if they need a few minutes, right? I know we're always like kind of on efficiency and we're busy, but if a client is really deep in their emotions, whether that's anger or sadness, give them a little bit, right? Ask them if they need a drink of water, if they need a second. Ask them if we need to reschedule this meeting, right? Because it just might not be the best time for them. Typically, if you give them a moment, they realize that they need this help too. And so it does help them. Most of the time, going to go back to neutral and you're going to be able to continue. But give space for that. Don't just try to power ahead and then have all of it be a waste. Don't raise your voice to argue with them. I know sometimes it sounds silly, but can actually happen a lot because as attorneys, we might know, right, that like they really need X, Y, and Z to get what they need, and that it would be really helpful for them. And if they are just so against X, Y, or Z, and you want to explain to them, like, this is going to help you, I know this, like, this is why I went to school, I know this information, and they are just not going to have it, our natural instincts can be sometimes to raise our voice to really make our point. And so at that point, you need to like take a step back, even if you need to leave, if you need a minute, that's also fine. And don't like join in the rant. So this also might sound silly, but if a client is going on about how they've been wronged by a school, right? And maybe the principal, their child's been suspended and they're talking about how messed up our school system is. And you might be like, yes, it is messed up, like, yes. And it's so natural to do that, but sometimes it can just make it worse because sometimes then you're just spiraling in how unjust our system is and you're there to try to fix something, right? We're not social workers, right? As attorneys, we're trying to fix the thing, right? And so you got to know what your space is and what your job is in that role.
Thanks, Alyssa. So the next part is just self-care and finding the value in our work. So I'm just gonna talk about that while I'm gonna put this up here for you all to read if you want. But I really like it. I think it really captures the like how hard it is to really do this work, and also taking space for yourself and really understanding what that means to you. And I think self-care, it's a lot of like when people think of that work, it's a lot of like shopping, bubble baths, etc. And for me, I think that what this means to me is that, shutting your phone off after 5, taking a break after a difficult interview with a client, little things that really can help you when you are stressed to the max, because with this work, and as we know, in the field, it's really, really difficult. And burnout, you can burn out really, really fast if you really don't understand yourself and what this looks like for you. And also, right, there's this concept of bearing witness. There is an inherent value in bearing witness to injustices and trying to help, even if you can't solve the problem. And for me, this was really difficult at the start of my career of like, you can't help everyone. And I think also, right, that saviorism comes in, but at that, like, you can't think that way. And it's important to just know that like you can't help everyone, but sometimes like if you do that intake or you're connecting with that client, and even if you say no, you were there to listen, and sometimes that's enough. And sometimes I have to remind myself with that. And again, essential to engage in practice of self-care. It's not just bubble baths. It's not just going shopping and spending absurd amount of money on yourself. Sometimes that's okay, maybe, but getting to know your own boundaries. This is really important. I know in social work school, we always talk about this, but I think in order to really, fully be good at your job, you need to understand your boundaries. What does this look like? Because it can show up on how you're working with a client, how you are working, within your organization and in the field, and what your limits, saying no. I know these sometimes are like really easy. Oh, I can say no, but sometimes like you take on too much, right? It's okay to say no. I'm sure that a lot of you are type A, like want to do so many things. But I think like it's better, quality over, I think, quality over quantity. But also, yeah, putting your phone away, turning off notifications, drinking water, eating, basic things that sometimes we forget to do when we're working on a case or we're going from outreach to outreach. Little things like that can really affect you. But I really want to just emphasize, like, when you start work and really thinking about it, especially since you're in law school, what does their limits and boundaries look like? Because that's really going to help you professionally and also, outside of professional life as well. And then self-care is different for everybody, right? But this is also a really good book. I know there's a lot of books in law school, so maybe later, but flag that. And then the last part, very important, ethics, confidentiality. Alyssa will take that away.
Yeah, so I know I've said this before, but like that attorney-client confidentiality is sacred and crucial to us of being able to be good advocates. And so it is on us, and I know you learn in professional responsibility, but to know what those rules are, to really know them. Even if it sounds silly, there's going to be times that come up where that saves your client because they confided in you and you were able to address it. So understand exactly what those rules are. And practice them wholeheartedly because they really are super critical and valuable. And read through them, know them, have them printed out in your office. Like they're critical. And make sure that you understand exactly where it applies. So on the rule of client-lawyer confidentiality applies in situations other than those where evidence is sought from the lawyer through compulsion of law. So understand what those situations are because it's broader a lot of the times than what we think. And it's easier to break than what we think, right? The confidentiality rule, for example, applies not only to matters communicated in confidence, but the client, but also to all information relating to the representation, whatever it's sought. And a lawyer may not disclose such information except as authorized or required by the rules of professional conduct. But having other people in the rule, having family members, right, that can break confidentiality to that person. So explaining that to your client, right, if you have your mom in here, if you have your dad in here, if you have your spouse in here, that can break rules of confidentiality. So make sure they really understand that, make sure they understand what that means, that you understand what that means so that they can make the best decision because that is really critical to being able to best support your client.
Oh, that's it. That's it.
Girl.
Thank you.
Or even though it's 11:30, I think we could try to take like 5 minutes for questions if people have any and move over willing. Any questions or in the Zoom if there's any questions?
It's a long one.
You used the word caseworker earlier. What does that mean?
Yeah. So a lot of the times, like a shelter will have a caseworker who's typically a social worker, and they're the ones who are kind of managing that client situation. So maybe they help them find housing, help connect them to us. They're kind of like helping arrange their schedule almost a lot of the times. Caseworkers will also be like at housing providers. We sometimes use caseworkers for like the guidance counselor at school. It's kind of anyone who's offering support, usually through an agency, and kind of helping organize them is kind of how I see it. So a lot of the times they might have the client's documents because maybe they had to get the birth certificate or the ID. And a lot of the times too, they're meeting with the client, the person, they're seeing them kind of regularly. Like if they're in a shelter, they might be seeing them every day. So they might have a better understanding too of what's going on. So it's always really great to ask if the client's comfortable with you talking to the caseworker. Because it's really helpful.
I was wondering if you have any tips on where your client's like home situation might involve, or like living situation might involve some violence, and sort of navigating that where like if you reach out to them that might put their safety at risk or cause some sort of turmoil, and just like navigating that so that you can prioritize their safety but still maintain like contact.
Yeah, so I think that is a very like tricky situation that unfortunately does come up quite frequently. So I think that's one of the important things when you're getting contact information is always asking, is this number safe? right? Is there a time or a space when it's okay to call this number, or do I need to wait for you to call me? And again, this is something we're partnering with a caseworker is really helpful, because often they have a better understanding of kind of that social situation. And so understanding like how they can communicate that information. And I think letting clients know, like we kind of have a list of resources that sometimes we give to clients. So, right, that's also helpful. Like if they have the number for a domestic violence hotline or for shelters, that they kind of know that you understand and give them that information. But I think the best thing is gauging and talking to your clients, figuring out, asking those questions. When is this safe? Is your home situation safe? Is this address safe? Is this number safe? Is this email safe? And before ever calling, like when I call to answer the phone, or sorry, when I call someone, I don't start by saying, hey, is this so-and-so? I always am like, hi. And I kind of wait for them to respond. And then ask like, oh, who's on the phone? I'm calling from CCH. And I try to kind of keep it really vague until I know. And then as soon as I know it is that person, I say, is now a good time to talk? Is now a safe time to talk? So I think it's just kind of continually asking those questions is the most important. And then as well, just being aware of what the resources are so you can connect them to that if that's not something your organization does.
And also too, just like if there is policies around that, that's like a good thing to ask your organization. And then also too, right, like if you have a social worker on staff and like, you know, you really can't build a safety plan, but like saying like with a client, like here are like different things we can do before they leave in a meeting if they're already with you. What Alyssa was saying, you know, like making sure that you're communicating and you're on the same page so we can reconnect is really important, just because like obviously like it's their safety is first, right? And making sure that you have like a protocol with them.
Yeah, I think also knowing your policies, like your organization's policy. So I know I had a client who called me and they needed to take an Uber to our appointment because there was you know, an unsafe situation happening. And so I asked my supervisor, like, hey, can CCH get an Uber because this client is unsafe? Their partner who they were planning to take them, like, it's not a safe idea. And CCH was fine with it. So also asking, like, are those types of things okay with your like organization, and kind of like being aware of that.
Okay, well, great, thank you, Christy.